everyone, it's Lisa Ross, and I want to thank you so much for joining me on this cowl adventure. Today I'm going to be showing you how we're going to finish off that cowl, and I have one final surprise that I hope you're going to love. So let's get started. All right, now where we last left off, we had just finished this side of the cowl. So I have all of my live stitches here. They're on my needle. I had you work this row a little bit differently than the other rows that we've been working before. There were no increases or decreases. And we are going to be finishing off this cowl with a 3 needle bind off. And there's a little caveat. We're going to do things a little differently once we get to the end. So I need to go back to my triangle. So if you take a look, this triangle right here, this is going to be the back of my cowl. We have this little notch here, and we kept that yarn on hold, which I'm going to be demonstrating how we're going to use that. I had put all of these stitches onto scrap yarn, so now I need to put them onto a needle. You can put these back onto gauge needles. I like to go down a needle size just because I have lots of extra needles, and it's easier to pick those stitches back up if I have a smaller needle. Of course, you're welcome to use gauge needles. Use whatever you have on hand. So because I have interchangeable needles, I used a 16-inch needle right here. And I'm just going to pick all of these stitches back up. Now you'll see like these first and last stitches especially are going to have been pulled tighter, looser, it depends, probably a little tighter, so you might have to work it out to fit that in. But what I want to do is slide my needle just as the yarn is. I'm just replacing that yarn with the needle. I'm going to slide this through and pick up all of those stitches. Okay, I've slid my needles through. You can see that yarn is still there, but I've counted to be sure that I have the correct number of stitches on my needle, and now I'm just going to take that yarn out. So I had tied it with a little bow. Now I just pull that right out, and my stitches are ready to be bound off. Okay, now this next part can be a little tricky for me to show in the small confines of my light box, but what I want you to do is have the entire cowl right side up. So lay it out nice and long, make sure the right side is entirely facing up and that you don't have any twists in your fabric. Then we're going to put our 2 needles together. So I have 2 sets of needles. I'm going to put them together. The right sides are together right now. I did not have any folds in, any twists in my fabric. The right sides are held together. And I've got my working yarn ready to work our bind off. So because of this, I'm going to just turn everything so that I'm ready to use these needles. Now, if you are a particularly tight bind off knitter, you may want to use a needle that is a size larger. You could even go up, 1 or 2 needle sizes to do your bind off, or you could just make a concerted effort to work the stitches loosely. Now, I had put these stitches from Clue 2, I put those onto a smaller needle. It's also not only a smaller gauge needle, but a smaller length of needle, just so that I can keep those separate and recognize the differences. Of course, you've got to work with whatever needles you have, and there are lots of different options when it comes to those. Now, I would normally use my gauge needles right here. I would use this 3rd needle right here for my 3 needle bind off. But to make it easier for the video, I actually just took one of my interchangeable tips, and this is what I'm going to use. And this tip is a size larger, just because that is what I have available. And also I do kind of tend to be tight with my bind off stitches. Now, what I'm going to do, I've got my working yarn still attached. I'm going to be knitting together one stitch from the front needle with one stitch from the back needle. So I'm going to begin by going into the first stitch on the front needle, into the first stitch on the back needle. You can see I'm just going in knitwise the way I would normally knit those stitches. I'm just doing it on 2 needles instead of 1. I'm going to scoop up that yarn just like I do when I knit and take both of those stitches off the needles. Now the tricky thing is you don't want any other stitches to come off the needles. If they do, just pop them back on as quickly as you can. Now I'm going to do that same motion again, knitting the first stitch from the front needle with the first stitch from the back needle, knitting those 2 together and pulling them off the needle. And now I need to bind off 1 stitch. So I'm going to use, I like to use the back needle. You could use either one, whatever is most comfortable for you. And I'm going to lift this second stitch on my right needle over the first stitch. So I'm going to scoop up that second stitch with this needle and pull it over the first stitch, just as if I'm doing a regular bind off, but we know this one's a little special. I'm going to continue doing this motion. I'm going to be knitting 2 together, taking those stitches off the needle and working that as a bind off stitch. So lifting the second stitch on the right needle over the first stitch. And I'm going to show you that a few more times. So go into the stitch on the front needle, into the stitch on the back needle, knit those 2 together, take them off the needles. And again, I just like to use this tip of my back needle. I don't even really move it very much. I'm more moving the right needle. And I just scoop up that second stitch to pull it over the first stitch. So let me show you that again. Go into the first stitch on the front needle, first stitch on the back needle, knit those 2 together, take it off. Make sure you haven't lost any other stitches, and you're going to lift the second stitch over the first stitch on the right needle. And once you get going, it goes pretty quickly, and we don't have too many stitches to do this with. So I'm just going to go ahead and work these. Now, you're going to have an option when we get to the end. You're not going to do all of the stitches. So as you're working your 3 needle bind off, I want you to stop at the last 4 stitches. So I'm going to continue this bind off, and then I will show you why we're stopping at those last 4 stitches. Okay, now here we are. We have 4 stitches left on either needle, and I have my bind off stitch on this right needle that I've been using, my 3rd needle. And now I'm going to give you an option. You can continue binding off those stitches and you will know what you have because you've been working it all along. But if you'd like to try something a little different, I encourage you to watch what I'm going to do next and you can give it a try if you're interested. All right, I'm going to remove these 2 needles, dropping 8 stitches, 4 stitches from either needle. I have this 1 stitch left. That's going to be the end of my bind off. So I'm going to cut the yarn, but leave a 12-inch tail, much longer than what I show in the video. And I'm going to make that stitch a little bit larger so that I can pull the yarn through just as you do when you break the yarn and pull the yarn through the final stitch. And now I have these loose stitches, and let me show you what I'm going to do. I'm turning this back to the right side so you can see what is happening. At this point, you need to make sure that all of your ends have been woven in, and be sure that you have not woven in any ends along these 4 edge stitches. These are the 4 edge stitches that I just took out, but make sure that all of your ends, when you weave them in toward the body of the cowl. Do not weave them in along these edge stitches. And here is why. I'm going to take this needle tip that I was using for my bind off and I'm going to start pulling out those 4 stitches. You can see that they're held securely by that twisted stitch border that we did. And this is the reason that we were working purl garter stitch instead, so that we had nice clean edges along here. You can see those nice clean color changes, but I have this option of creating a self-fringing shawl. You've been working fringe all this time and you didn't even know it. So if you can see, when I'm taking this needle and pulling, what I'm doing is taking one of these purl bumps. So if you can see between these 2 stitches right here, so in between those 2 middle stitches, there's a little purl bump. All I do is pull on that and the fringe comes right out, just like this. And it doesn't even have to be between those 2 stitches. You could do any of those purl bumps and just tug. If you pull on one of the stitches, you're not going to have an easy time of it. So just do those bumps that are in between the 2 purl stitches, like this. And you'll see that our fringe is starting to emerge. I'm going to go ahead and fringe the entire shawl, and you'll see right here where we did our 3 needle bind off, we have some stitches there too. So there is a break because we had our bound off stitches. So I'm going to go back and I'm also going to pull those stitches out so that they fringe as well. I find this to be so satisfying. Pulling out those stitches, I don't know, it makes me so happy. I hope it makes you happy too. Now, again, if you don't like the look of fringe, that's totally fine. We've been working this cowl in such a way that you don't have to fringe it. You have your clean lines between your color changes, and it's totally fine to keep it as is. But I did specifically design this cowl to have that surprise fringe at the end, and I'm super excited about it. And I'm finished. Instant fringe all the way around my cowl. Now, of course, it is not going to look like this after it's been blocked. These fringes are going to get nice and smooth. They're not going to be all bumpy like this. And then you will have some options. You can keep it exactly as it is. You can cut the strands halfway so that you have single fringe rather than looped fringe. Or you can even take 2 sections together and knot them. So I could take 2 loops and make a knot right here at the base. I'll show you what that looks like. Just like that. And I can keep those as loops, or I can cut them however I'd like to do it. It's totally up to you. Now I'm going to go back to the back of my cowl. Now I've got these fringes all along here, except for this little hole right in the middle. Now, I feel like it is perfectly acceptable to keep that gap right between your fringe because this is the back of the cowl, and I actually kind of like the way it looks with that little gap right there. It sort of has that divide where you have all of these triangles and you have a little gap right there in your fringe because it is the back of the shawl, or back of the cowl, sorry. But we kept this yarn right here. So I'm going to unclip it. It's been waiting patiently all this time. And now I can string this through and I can add 2 loops to either side to finish off the fringe. So that's totally up to you if you'd like to do that or not. All right, so I have this extra yarn that I kept on hold. I had it just balled up and attached to the back of my cowl. And if I want to complete the fringe, I can just put this needle through here. I'm basically just going to take the yarn and loop it to the same length and then knot it in the back to create the final fringe. So I want the yarn to begin right here. I'm going to stick it into this stitch right there so that the yarn is behind this twisted stitch fabric. And depending on the cast on you used, yours might look a little bit different than this, so you might have to sort of play with it until you get it the way you like it. Also, just keep in mind that if you don't like the way that your fringe looks by weaving it in with the needle, it's totally fine to just keep it without this final fringe. It's totally acceptable. I give you permission. All right, so I want to make my loop about as long as the fringe yarn. And then I'm going to pull it through this next stitch. So I'm going behind the work and I'm going up through between the stitches that are next to it like this. And I'm going to just go back to the wrong side by surrounding that stitch. So I'm going to go like this. So it went across one stitch and to the back, and you see there's that little loop right here. Now, I will give you the disclaimer, sewing is not my strong suit, and if you are a sewist, you may have better ways of doing this. This is my sewing as a knitter. All right, I'm holding on to that yarn. I don't want to make that loop any shorter. All right, so I'm looking at the back now, and I need to create a knot just to secure that yarn. So I'm going to go through this stitch right here, just kind of picking two backs of the stitches to go through like this. And then that's going to create this little hole that I put my yarn or put my needle through just to create a little knot right there. So that is snugged up and secure. Now I'm doing 3 more of these. So it's, it doesn't have to be super duper secure. You just want it to be secure enough to keep that fringe going. So let me look at the front again. This time I'm going next to that center stitch. I'm going right in between these 2 center stitches so that I can create a little fringe right there. Make sure the rest of your fringes don't get caught up. I'm going to go over that stitch so that my fringe will come up behind here, like this. Okay. I'm going to basically make that same movement again, going up through that same part that I just went through and over that stitch, but this time I'm going to stay on the wrong side. So it's just kind of looped around that stitch. And I'm going to secure it in place by putting it through the backs of some stitches like this and pulling the yarn through. Oops, and did it. It was going just fine and I messed it up. All right, pulling it through and making that little knot. Okay, I'm going to repeat those steps, making 2 more fringes to fill in the gap. All right, so I just took that yarn and wove it around each stitch, secured it with a little knot in the back. Now, after you've worked the fringe all the way around, we're going to go back to this yarn that we had from our 3-needle bind off. Now, there is a little bit of a seam right here, but that goes away once we block our cowl. It'll get nice and flat and you'll hardly even notice that there is a bind off there. But I want to finish off this 3-needle bind off with just a little loop of fringe. So I'm going to take my yarn, and I should have left a longer tail. My instructions will be to leave you a longer tail. And I'm going to go up through this gray stitch right here. This was part of my clue 2. I'm going to pull it through and just leave a loop that's the same length as the other loops. I'm just holding it next to that other loop to judge it that way. Then I'm going to go across that bind off. So I'm going to go across both the gray and the blue and pull that through. I don't want to make my loop any smaller, so I'm being very careful on how I pull that through. Okay, then I'm going to the wrong side and I'm just going to secure it back there. And the way I'm going to do that is just going to be going over my bound off stitches right here, pulling it through those, and then you'll create like a little hole from where you pulled it through. I'm just going to pull that yarn right through there to create a knot. Just going to secure that in place. And now I just weave in that last end and I have my final loop right there. Now I'm going to go and soak my shawl, get these, the fringe nice and smooth, smooth out the rest of the stitches, and I will be all finished with my cowl. Thank you so much for joining me on this mystery adventure. I wish you all very happy knitting.